Right.
Mandy Sloan McDowell, welcome to Mary Esther United Methodist Church. I've been excited for this opportunity to chat with you and to allow our congregation to hear some different voices. I plan to do this on a fairly regular basis so that my congregation, because they hear my junk all the time, right? So I've been here a couple of years, and so they know a lot of my tricks, and so I want to expose them to some different voices. So thank you for being willing to come and share some time with us.
It's an honor. You and I have been friends for a long time, but you've been teaching me longer than you probably realize. And so anytime you want to talk to me, I'm honored to be a part of the conversation because I always wind up learning far more than I may contribute. So on behalf of me and my congregation, who are also really glad to have some additional voices preaching on Sunday.
Oh, that's right, because we're showing this both directions. Yes, we are. So that's great. Yes, and I'm delighted to be with First United Methodist Church in Los Angeles as well. Clearly, the psalmist has encountered a crisis of some kind.
Right.
And that crisis is now giving way to complaint, or what we would call lament. And, I know that lamentation is not something that our culture seems very adept at. Why do you think that is? Why do you think lamentation is difficult for people? And what do we tend to do instead?
Such a good question. I mean, we live in a culture that I'd say too that we're living in a time where some of that is probably shifting. But one of the things I would see consistently, I have a daughter, and so I see the things that are marketed for girls in terms of clothing and apparel and attire, and the thing that they want to stamp on every T-shirt is good vibes only. And it annoys me because I do not espouse good vibes only. And I feel like it's the plea to say, I can't handle your truth. And if there's one thing that seems to be clear right now, it's that, at the very least in America, America's telling the truth. Now, I'm not saying that the truth hadn't been told before. Of course it had. Of course it had. But now everyone's listening.
Yeah. And that's not, as we were saying a little bit earlier, that not everyone is in a place where they're prepared to hear, whether it's the lamentation of others, or even the need to raise their voice and say 4 times, like this psalmist does in 2 verses, how long, right? How long is this going to last? And I think it has been a crazy year. I mean, do you remember back when there were wildfires in Australia? Doesn't that seem like it was about 5 years ago?
Yes. Or like a book I read once when I was a kid. I mean, so serious, everyone very concerned. But that was like 31 years ago. I literally couldn't quantify how much time it's been.
And then, then suddenly we find ourselves thrust into a worldwide pandemic, which causes massive disruptions. We also see people of color suffer with that disease at more destructive rates than white people do. So, I've wondered to myself if some of that angst, and then of course it doesn't feed into this experience of seeing, in particular, these 3 murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and just the gut-wrenching lament, I think that rises up from so many people of all hues, right, at seeing that, has forced us in some ways into a period of lament.
Mm-hmm. I do think it's true too, based on all the things that you just said, that some cultures do lament real well. really well. And so like gospel music is based in lament. And that is one of the reasons why I think we're turning to this right now, is because there's language borrowed from the Psalms, borrowed from scripture, borrowed from Exodus, borrowed from the language of people who've been lamenting all this time. And, you know, we talk about fragility. I love the idea that fragility can be described in two very different ways. One is that we just can't take it, you know, and that's something that needs to be.
It's just so hard. I can't watch that anymore today.
Yes. No, I mean, granted, we all have like our capacity to deal with
Sure.
hard things, but dealing with hard things is the first step. Ignoring them and pretending like they don't exist is a crisis of fragility that needs to be dealt with. And I think it's that sort of fragility prevents lament from being a common language. And most people don't have the benefit of fragility. People who have been oppressed do not have the benefit of fragility at all. So lament becomes the only language that we have to contend with what is true, and in some ways what is universal to the experience of being oppressed. And the worst thing is that if you're the oppressor, you have to contend with some really ugly things about yourself. I know I have. And that takes work.
What seems to be bugging the psalmist the most here, do you think, in these first two verses?
How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? I mean, that just touches right there on my own personal fear of abandonment. That's what I immediately think of, is an interpersonal relationship that has gone awry. You know, like that's the language of a breakup right there.
Yeah. It feels a little bit adolescent maybe to me, and maybe that's just me, but you know, it's just like it's forever, right? And you know, always, and like you know, how long is this just taking forever, you know? But still, there are times and moments when we feel, I think, so disconnected from the God that you know, we in my preaching 2 weeks ago, I talked about Psalms of orientation, which are Psalms that reflect life when life is good, and you can be just proclaim God as trustworthy and true and patient and present and high and lifted up, and just this soaring language about one's relationship with God. And when that feels like it's been disconnected, it's painful, right? It is painful.
Yeah. And you know, the second verse about bearing pain in my soul, one of the things I really appreciate about the Psalms is that there is a variety of emotional experiences represented, even in the context of one psalm itself. And you know, we'll move to that in a bit. But for what you're discussing about Psalms of orientation, and this one clearly being a psalm of disorientation, how quickly it seems that move happens for the psalmist.
Yes.
And I think, you know, if we're going into a question about like, well, what does this psalm tell me about God, or how is God moving in this particular psalm? Right now, it's very egocentric. This is 100% based on the experience of the psalmist trying to figure out where God's face is.
Yes. It's very close to the individual person who's praying. And pain does that. Pain brings us into our skin. Right. So then in the next two verses of the psalm, there is this move, as one of the commentaries that I was reading said, that you know we've gone from crisis to complaint, but now the mood shifts a bit from complaint to plea, right? Just to like supplication, right? Where the psalmist says, you know, answer me, God. Give light to my eyes, or I shall sleep the sleep of death. What do you think is going on there?
I mean, there's a definite tonal shift here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the point where the psalmist stops focusing internally. And again, to what you said earlier, pain is personal. And when anyone is in pain, whether it is physical, emotional, or spiritual, that pain limits our access to things outside of ourselves. So this is not a critique of what pain does, more than it is an awareness that it will bring us inward. And the whole world starts becoming about our own experience of how to contend with the pain. And this seems to be the shift. Verse 3 seems to be the shift where the psalmist finally turns outward. And even though the plea has been, how long, O Lord, how long, O Lord, how long, O Lord, the demand for an answer, I think, is the invitation for God to participate in the conversation. And the thing I really love about this is something that I think we wrestle with. If we tend to be so fragile that we can't even lament, we can't even name hard emotions, I think one of the second flaws of the Christian role of trying to be faithful is the idea that we can't ask God hard questions.
And one of the great gifts of the entire book of Psalms is that, like I have said over and over in this series, that there is a psalm for every season of life. And there is no question left unasked, right? There is no stone left unturned in one's relationship, with God. And it is a gift for us to be able to witness, here ostensibly David, the king of, right, the king of Israel, a man at quote unquote after God's own heart, who then is able to, at the beginning of this psalm, shake their fist at the heavens and accuse, not only complain, but accuse God of deliberately ignoring him. But then to take that breath, I can hear the breath between verse 2 and verse 3.
Right?
Where the psalmist is like, okay, all right, consider me, O Lord, and answer me, right? Like, okay, I'm calming down a bit. We can have more, there's a possibility for two-way communication, right?
Yeah.
But I think all of us at some point in time in relationships have, and so what the psalmist seems to do is to basically treat God more or less like anyone else, like any other relationship in their lives.
Yeah. I like to put this in the language of, we try to think about what can I tell God? Like I'm angry at God, but I'm not going to tell God that because I don't want to make God angry at me.
Yeah.
And I think if God created the heavens, the earth, and all that is in it, God can take it. God can handle your anger. God can handle the injustice that you're experiencing. God can handle your lament. God can handle your whining. God can take it. God can take it. And the worst thing we can do is to stay silent, because that ends the communication.
Yes.
And right? So I love the idea that the psalmist is insisting now on dialogue. Like I've said my piece and counted to 10, and it's your turn, and I need answers. And I think time and time again, like Job is probably the best example of this, when God shows up at the last third of the book and says, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth, when I laid the foundation of the world? Where were you? Because I can tell you where you were.
Yeah.
I know where you were, and I was there all along. And you mentioned it in your dynamic, talking about what this means for trust. And I think you and I have addressed, like, what is the nature of lament? And the nature of lament comes from a relationship that matters.
Yes.
Like, it didn't matter. I wouldn't lament to somebody who doesn't know my story, who doesn't know me, who I don't trust with my feelings or my experiences. So this is a conversation that is predicated on trust.
What I'm hearing you say, correct me if I'm wrong, is that to complain and to bring our whole selves before God is not an expression of our doubt in God's presence or action in our lives. It is the expression of trust and faith.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And I think one of the reasons that we get afraid to fist shake our, the hands of the heavens is because God responds, and it's unpleasant sometimes. Isn't that what the task of faith is to both know God and love God and then be changed by that relationship. And so our fear is that God is so judgmental and so angry. But the thing that is 100% consistent is that it's never anger that upsets God. It's infidelity.
Oh, the language, the language that we hear frequently throughout the Bible is that I am a jealous God.
Yeah.
Right. I am a jealous God. That I think that is so wise and insightful, that God can handle our anger, and I think God hears and cares about our anger and our difficult experiences and our experiences of being lonely or the absence of God. But I think God has a hard time, apparently biblically, a hard time tolerating when we just easily, trollop off to worship something else,
Yeah. And, David is not immune to that, which means that David's idolatry of Bathsheba and the subsequent events that transpire, the way in which he deals with Uriah, all of that means that David is not immune to his own capacity to build an idol and to turn away from God. And so what this tells me is that as much as God really doesn't like that, God consistently returns and consistently stays active in the relationship between us and God, even when we're bad at it.
What are the idols that tempt us away from a God who both seeks to minister, comfort, and care for us in our illnesses, but then also seeks justice for and equanimity for God's people? What are the things that we're likely to turn to as idols?
The first thing that came to mind is tradition.
Say more about that.
When I moved to Atlanta, I saw with my own two eyes the fact that everybody in any kind of service position was Black. And I'd known for a long time, I was aware of the absolute distinction between the white experience and the Black experience, but had no sense of my own capacity to do anything about it. And frankly, it's a helpless feeling because, one of the things I've had to be clear about with myself and my very white children is that we are born privileged. We are born racist. We have to do this very systemic, internal, eye-opening, painful work to dismantle the structures of racism that we have so easily built into the fabric of our lives. And it could take everything down.
One of the things that I had to, when that word was first applied to me, racist, and when I began to try to apply it to myself and felt that pushback, I had to embrace for myself that it's not about my badness or my goodness, it's about my blindness or my sightedness. Okay. Yeah. So we can still be super nice. We can be super nice people with only the best of intentions. Yeah. But because we just can't see, right? We just can't see and we don't often trust what people of color are telling us about the place where we live and the structures and systems that we maintain. So.
One of the points that when you and I were prepping for this, one of the things, and I feel certain it came from you. So Sam, I'm gonna quote you and credit you, but I also want to say it out loud because I think it's important. One of the things that happens in verse 3 when the psalmist says, "Give light to my eyes," I think for a lot of us, our eyes, as you said, we are now sighted where we once were blind. And you said, the shift here comes when we stop projecting our crisis onto God and we own it for ourselves.
I think that was mutually developed, but
Right.
anyway, it was the conversation that made it happen. So there you go. Yeah, I think that I think in our initial panic and anxiety, panic attack over the brokenness, what feels like a brokenness in our relationship with God, we don't want to own it. And, we blame God, but God is big enough to handle it. But there will hopefully come a moment when we turn and say, well, maybe it's what I can't see.
Yeah.
And maybe I need your help, God, to see something bigger. Now, I will say that the psalmist talks about wanting to win a lot.
Yeah.
Doesn't want their enemies to rejoice over them. Doesn't want, what is the language? Yes, my foes will rejoice because I'm shaken. Which led me to kind of wonder, I wonder if that's why God might be feeling absent, because I'm not sure that God's agenda is all about winning.
Yeah. Like, what is God winning here?
Or defeating, I'm not sure that God is all about defeating our enemies, right? I think that's where, we see in the person of Jesus Christ, that God who doesn't accompany us in all of our more or less petty feelings of anger at people who disdain us or whatever. There's some other better way to say that. I'm trying to hook some Jesus in here, Mandy.
You're doing it. But it's that idea that every sports team that prays God, give us this victory, the other sports team, God somehow up in heaven with the remote, not the Dodgers again. Jesus actually does say a lot about enemies, and offensive things, mean, nasty things like love them and turn the other cheek. You haven't met my enemies, Jesus. They're terrible. I'm sure you don't mean that.
If you have anything against your brother, leave your offering at the altar and then go and be reconciled to them. And then you mean you're telling me that I can't even authentically worship unless I fix it with my enemies? So that makes me wonder in this psalm whether God is feeling absent, because that's just not God's jam. That's not God's bag, right?
Right.
So. Well, then there's this third movement, and it's the movement, I think sometimes we short circuit these first two of the prayer of complaint and then the prayer of supplication, and we kind of get here too quickly. But if we will go through these first two paths, right, through these first two doorways, then we can then enter into this room of praise, moving from plea to praise, with a lot more appreciative and fuller voice.
And it's this kind of dings back on the idea of cheap grace, right? This psalm is only 6 verses.
Yeah, right.
And to go from how long will you hide your face to me to I will sing to the Lord because he's dealt bountifully with me. We have skipped over a lot of emotional trajectory here. And I find it, this is what are we, good vibes only now? I'm not satisfied that we had enough time, but it's because for whatever reason, the psalm was brief. And for whatever reason, it encapsulated the emotional arc that needed to be described, which is, complaint, plea, praise. That's it. That's enough. Those are all the things you have to do. And perhaps we get to this because the psalmist was honest.
Yeah, right. So we arrive at this point of praise. And one of the things that I love about these last two verses is this sense of perspective, the verb tenses. And here's what, the psalmist says, I trusted, past tense, in your steadfast love. and so my heart shall rejoice in your salvation, right? Because I trusted you in the past and have experienced salvation from you in the past. All right, I'm willing to be patient, knowing that my day of rejoicing is going to come. I know your deliverance is going to come. And I love that. I think one of the idols that we can turn to is nostalgia.
Oh, yes. Well said. I think that's really what tradition is, right?
Right. In other words,
Yeah.
that, right. Or let's
heritage
say that there's a healthy form of tradition and a pathological form of tradition,
yes.
right? That there's a kind of tradition that we use to avoid to avoid change,
Change.
right?
Yeah.
To avoid adaptation and growth, personal growth. Growth as a congregation, right?
Growth as a country, right?
huh? And see,
Growth as a
like,
country. Yeah.
so there's that sense of nostalgia. However, there is a healthy sense of tradition, a healthy sense of relating to the past.
Right.
And that is drawing on our experiences of grace that can provide us just enough hope that we believe we will not only experience that grace in the future, but we can actually become a source of it, right? For other people.
The idea, there's this wonderful James Baldwin quote. James Baldwin wrote, "The history is not past, it is the present. We carry our history with us." And this idea that the tension between the psalmist saying, because I trusted in your steadfast love, I will rejoice in your salvation and I will sing to the Lord. Like these things are not distinct, they're not separate. And in the sense that God lives in time in an eternal way that is different than our chronological way of thinking, this sort of unravels the entire experience of what it means to be in relationship with the eternal being.
Yes.
It's that, we're so limited. We are finite. We're on a time with calendars. God doesn't live that way. God does not exist that way. God can be past, present, future. Jesus can be crucified, died, and risen, and ascended, and yet present. God is different than us. And we are so finite in our capacity to both understand that. I mean, we just are.
Yes.
But also to give God grace to be God. Well, and I think that that's the, if anything that we're learning right now, it's that words are futile unless they are paired with action. Then, one of the gut punch things that's really easy for me to say is, but I didn't do that. I didn't treat you that way.
Right.
I didn't. Yes, I did. Absolutely, I did. Because my history and my ancestors are 100% culpable and responsible. And if I have the audacity and the hubris to think that I don't benefit from that today, I am wrong. And I can't look away from my wrongness anymore. So my history is not past. My awareness of my place in time does not relieve me from the responsibility that I have now. That my past holds me accountable to how I live, not just in the present, but in the future.
So let me wrap up in this way. Let me see if I can make a summative statement of some kind. That what this psalm does for us, or what God offers us through the gift of the Word of God in this psalm, is the knowledge that we can be unvarnished in who we are before God. That in our difficulty in our relationship with God, that may be more about us than it is about God. And that there are some things perhaps we need to understand about ourselves, that we need light to the eyes so that we can see some things. But that praise of God really is born out of a long game with the divine. And it's not our game, right? It's God's long game with us, right? Nobody does this better than Methodists, right? Prevenient grace, justifying grace, sanctifying grace, glorifying grace, 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 grace upon grace. But that each moment of difficulty and lament needs to be authentically experienced, but it also needs to be, we also need to be able to rise up, like we put our spiritual drone out a little bit so that we can see sort of the larger landscape of God, not in a cheap way, right? Not to just get past lament, but in order to put it in a larger sense of perspective. Does that help?
I think that's great.